All right, so we're going to stay on the factoring train, and now we're going to look at what do I do if I've got 4 terms. That seems daunting, but it's not. So we do what we call factoring by grouping. What does that mean? That means that we group things and then factor. So see what I mean? I got 4 terms, right? So and then I got 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. Okay, so if I have 4 terms, what do I want to do? I want to group them. And how do I want to do that? I want to group the first 2, and I want to group the second 2. Now, I want to point out, notice that this plus sign stayed outside of the group. So I didn't create multiplication, right? It's just these are a group, these are a group. So now what we're going to do is within each group, we are going to take out a greatest common factor from the group. So if I look at the first group, well, this is a 3 and this is an 18. 3 is a factor of 3. 3 is also a factor of 18. Here I have an m cubed and an m squared. M squared is a factor of m squared, and m squared is also a factor of m cubed. So I'm going to take out a 3m squared, and I'm going to be left with m plus 6. Now, what can I take out of the second group? Well, this is an 8, and this is a 48. 8 is a factor of 8. 8 is also a factor of 48. This has an m. This doesn't have an m, so I can't take out any m's. So then I still have this plus. So that plus stays there. And then I'm going to factor out an 8, and I'm left with m plus 6. Now, factoring by grouping worked, and I did it correctly, if what I'm left over with in both sets of parentheses, whoops, that didn't highlight how I wanted, if what I'm left over with in both sets of parentheses is exactly the same. If those are not exactly the same, then I either did something wrong, or this would not factor by grouping. Now, since those are the same though, that tells me that that is one of my factors. So I'm going to factor out m plus 6. And if I factor out m plus 6 from this whole term, then I'm left over with 3m squared. And if I factor out m plus 6 from this term, I'm left over with just 8. So that is my factoring by grouping. Now, another thing I'd point out, and I didn't say this before, but we would look for a greatest common factor first, if just like with any factoring, right? There was no greatest common factor here. Okay, let's try the next one to make sure we understand this. The next one has one thing that we really have to pay attention to. And so let's see if I can. Okay. So the thing that we have to pay attention to is the minus sign right here. If the third term, and it really only matters for the third term, has a minus, before I group, what I want to do is I want to make this a plus. I want to use my pen. So I'm going to make this a plus, and then I'm going to put the negative inside the group on the 4. So now I'm going to go ahead and group, and I have it like this. And I know this looks a little crammed, but again, similar to up here, I want that plus outside of the parentheses, so in between these 2 parentheses, but I don't want to lose the negative. And I'm not distributing the negative. The negative was only on the 4z, so I just want that in the parentheses here. Now, what's my greatest common factor in the first group? I see a z squared. Let's take it out. Z squared, and I'm left with z plus 5. Now, what's my greatest common factor in the second group? And this is really important on why this is a negative 4. Well, I could say that the greatest common factor is 4, which is true. There's nothing wrong with that. However, notice, and again, going back to up here, I need what's left over in the parentheses to be the same. If it's not, I either did something wrong or it didn't work. I can see pretty quickly that if I factor out a positive 4 from negative 4z and minus 20, I would be left with negative z minus 5. But I want it to be positive z plus 5. So instead of factoring out a positive 4, I'm going to factor out a minus 4, and then I will be left with z plus 5. Now, just to double check, you can always think about, well, what would I get if I distributed, right? So negative 4 times z is negative 4z, and negative 4 times 5 is negative 20. So I know I've done that correctly. I can also see that these are the same. So that just confirms that the factoring by grouping worked and I did it correctly. Now z plus 5 is one of my factors, and then z squared minus 4 is my other factor. Hold on a sec. What do we notice here? Wait a minute. Z squared minus 4. Oh my god. Difference of squares. Who knew? Great. That is amazing. So, my final answer, if I could write, would be z plus 5 times z minus 2 times z plus 2, because I'm factoring z squared minus 4 as the difference of squares, so that becomes z minus 2, z plus 2. Boom. That was fun. All right, I want you to try both of these. So pause the video, factor, unpause when you're ready to check. All right, so the first thing I did here before I grouped was I made the minus of the third term a plus, and I brought that little negative inside on the x. Now, I grouped the first two, grouped the second two. From the first two, I saw I could factor out an x squared, so I take that out, and I'm left with x plus 4. From the second two, and maybe this was a little bit difficult to see, remember 1 is always a factor of everything, which also means negative 1 is also a factor of everything. So I took out a negative 1. Again, going back to the previous problem, the reason why I know I needed to take out a negative 1 was I wanted what's left over in the parentheses to become x plus 4. So I took out a negative 1. This becomes x plus 4. I'm showing in my highlight here that those are good. Those are the same. So I know that x plus 4 is one of my factors, and then I'm left over with x squared minus 1. Coincidentally, similar to what we saw before, x squared minus 1 is the difference of squares. So this factors into x plus 1 and x minus 1. And I still have my x plus 4. Next one. Here, I grouped. I didn't have to worry about a minus this time. So from the first group, I pulled out a y squared, and I'm left with 3y plus 1. From the second group, I pull out a 3, and I'm left with 3y plus 1. Again, those are the same, so that's good. That's one of my factors down here. I had y squared plus 3 left over. That's my other factor. This does not factor. It's not the difference of squares. So I'm done. All right, factoring by grouping. We look for 4 terms. So if I have 4 terms, then I want to try and factor by grouping. As always, and I know we didn't see this in an example on this video, but you still want to check for a greatest common factor first.